Yeah, so we were talking about this trade with China, but again, uh, we can right now, it's actually happening right there. This trade war between China and the US, it's going on. But again, it's a political decision, as we can see. We can pull out of a lot of this agreement. We can start confronting China and trading less with it if we choose to. Now, whether that has a positive effects is a different question, but it is still a political choice. And certainly, if the world tumbles back into war, if the US goes to war with China, Europe goes to war with Russia, it will create tremendous disruption of trade and a lowering in the level of globalization. The point is simply that globalization higher than it ever was before, more diverse, more global to different parts of the world than before. But it's certainly something that can be pulled back, not easily. I think it would take some cataclysmic, cataclysmic like war, or maybe really, a government regime that really out there a little bit crazy. And again, I'm not suggesting that Trump is there. I mean, he's trying to push in this direction, but mostly it's still business as usual in the world. Um, okay, that's the main point that I wanted to get across there about globalization. So now, um, that's a little bit on background on globalization, and particularly not just about globalization itself, but this idea of how it impacts countries' ability to choose. Um, let's look more specifically at the at a piece on globalization and self-government. Um, Indeed, the question here is uh, kind of a larger one, is about whether globalization is good for democracy. And the piece starts off and says, yeah, um, I think in general, when we talk about globalization, we say, yeah, one of the things about democracy now, why democracy has been able to spread from very few countries being democratic 100 years ago to now is, they say, much of it has spread on the wings of globalization. Countries being in contact, countries being in contact with democratic countries, democratic practices, democratic aspirations have rubbed off, even on authoritarian countries. And they have had difficulty going against the flow, if that's what you want to call it. Also, as the author says, there are really very few alternatives to democracy uh, that are being pushed out um, there. Some of the few packets of the world that are still somewhat more authoritarian, such as Middle East, right, that offer maybe the option of Islamic fundamentalism. uh, the author says, come on, right, it might still be common in the Middle East, but certainly not all right, certainly not something that's going to be exported. Oh wow, what about Sharia law coming to England and US? My only comment here is, really? No, it's not seen as a global model. It's seen as a regional model, obviously, that wants to be spread. But if you really honestly believe that, within next 20 years, Canada is going to be Islamic fundamentalist state, or Western New York or New York is going to be Islamic fundamentalist state, I think you need to become more informed. It's not good to say, all right. So Islamic fundamentalism is not an option. A better option, probably about 20 years ago, and again, this piece is a little bit older, so that's why it really addresses this. It's the option to say, well, let's have a rather than this kind of wide open democracy, which is typically of US, Canada, or Western Europe, about a much more limited democracy, a democracy where first and foremost it's about order in society, and that there is quite as much not quite as much choice. You do things for the collective again. Mm, China might be an example of this right now, and it was this idea that people don't need that many rights. You don't need free speech and things like that in a society. As long as you are taken care of this is the idea maybe behind what we call Asian values. And author seems to say, well, you, after the financial crisis of 1990s, late 1990s, which occurred at a point when many were saying, oh, the most dynamic economies in the world are Japan, China is growing, Korea is growing, uh, was a huge setback when they got hit by the financial crisis. Many people said, okay, mm, that's not really a model we want to follow, because even having a more authoritarian, limited democratic approach does not produce stable economic outcomes. So let's stick with the liberal democracy which we have got. Again, the democratic values, or again, the democracy also goes very well with the international trading system. In a market economy, almost every democracy that you have got has a pretty strong tendency towards capitalism. So, and wanting to embrace free trade rather than be closed off it. So, globalization and democracy seems to go very well together. Once you got a democracy in place, most people want that. They want the iPhone, they want coffee beans from places that taste good, they want bananas. So if you give them the ability to choose through their votes, like you do in a democracy, people are going to generally choose globalization. Now, again, it doesn't always have to be. We have seen some step back from that. Perhaps the US election of 2016 was a retreat from globalization. Brexit in UK is another example. Certainly, it's an example. So it's not a given, but I think the dominant way of thinking in the world is for globalization more rather than less. Again, this idea that globalization is also good for democracy, because when the countries are quite interconnected, there is a big time free flow of information. So if you have got a closed authoritarian regime in place, that is going to be undermined by information that comes and says, listen, the propaganda here is saying that people in capitalist countries or in democratic countries aren't doing well and they are very unhappy. But look at all these goods they seems to have. Look at the TV programs, look at the opulent lifestyle, and the free flow of information tends to sell democracy and capitalism rather well. Okay, but the big question here is, it says, well, then globalization is good for democracy, right? And they said, maybe not. What we really need to do is unpackage what we mean by liberal democracy. And again, liberal democracy has two different aspects. The first of this is popular sovereignty. You have got liberal democracy. What it simply means is the government and government decision making is made by the people, a majority of the people who govern themselves. They choose representatives who reflect their interest. And that means simply the laws that are produced in a society essentially come from the individuals. Now, again, you might argue, well, this is somewhat wrapped. I say I go to vote, but my vote doesn't count as much as a millionaire's vote or a billionaire's vote, because my representatives will listen to the money even more than to votes. Tough luck. What can I say, right? But in general, there is this idea that in a liberal democracy we have popular sovereignty. We have the ability to choose what we want. The other aspect of liberal democracy is this idea that it exists to limit the scope and reach of government. That you have generally a bunch of rights listed, like we have got Bill of Rights in the amendments. Those are the things that government cannot undo it, right? It's a list of things that can't impede our rights to free speech. You can't um, take away, bear harms. We have certain guarantees, right? The government just can't throw us into a jail and keep us there indefinitely. And that the government also in a sense, should be able to limit our choices, meaning also should not be able to limit our choices, meaning our economic choices. It can tax us for sure, but it can't tell us 100% what to do, what we want with what we own. Of course, there is the later part as a tremendous affinities with globalization. Globalization is this idea that government shouldn't just be able to close us down like we have in an import substitution industrialization policy. It was that an attempt by the government said, no, you can't. Well, we can make it extremely difficult for you to buy goods from abroad, whether it's refrigerator from abroad or whatever. And that's not really the way things are right now. If you want to buy stuff from China, it's very easy. The tariffs are quite, um, the government doesn't get in place with that. The car tariffs are low. You just go to Walmart and buy your Chinese goods. It's not that difficult. And as such, one of the things about globalization is that it takes certain power out of the government's hand to say, no, we are going to close off our markets to foreign investment and to foreign products. You can't do that anymore. If you are part of the WTO, you must let these goods in, which takes some power away from the government, but for us as an individual consumer gives us a lot more choices. So the point is simply here that they are making, is that sometimes globalization threatens democracy, because what it does is it does remove decision making from the national level. Particularly if you are a smaller or a developing country, uh, where you kind of have no choice but kind of seen that, right in the case of Mexico or Nigeria, when it got tremendous into debt, they said, okay, um, we are going to be getting not going to be getting any more money unless you change, unless you open yourself up, unless you sell some of your government owned businesses internationally. And that can be a big problem. Again, if you are a voter and you say, I want to vote in Donald Trump because he has promised to retain steel making to the US, right? He has promised to return steelmaking to the US. I want a job. I am here in Western New York. We used to produce steel 40 years ago, which we will be able to do it again. Now, again, we are not very competitive in a global market. So we are going to have to protect ourselves. We will have to put trade barriers against countries that can produce steel cheaper. But I am counting on my president to be able to do that for me, or my Congress to do that for me. Okay, so you vote for them. Can Congress really do that? It can, but if it does so, it is going to risk violating international law based on these global ideals. And then what do you do? It usually keeps the government from making such choices. Maybe it does do those choices, but then again, it's going to be hurting some other industry. So, to a large extent, this has removed our ability to actually govern ourselves. Because even if you want to something to happen, right? If we vote to in a leader who says, I'm going to be more protectionist, usually that leader is somewhat full of hot hair, as we have seen in the case of current administration.